So many producers, no matter how experienced, struggle to get drums that knock. Even when you think your sound selection is good, you put the samples together and sometimes your drums just sound weak. They don't cut through the mix, so you just crank up the volume and you end up distorting with very bad sounding drums. Well, if this is you, you're in luck, because today I'm gonna give you 7 very practical, actionable steps to follow to make your drums really knock like the top producers in the charts. And I'm gonna show you that this method works on any types of drums, from real drums to house drums to hip-hop drums. So no matter the genre that you're producing, this is gonna apply to you. We're gonna go from this to this. The difference is massive, and I'm gonna show you how to achieve this both with my favorite pro plugins and with stock plugins as well. So no matter what you're working with, you're gonna get the same results. I'm so hyped to share all of this with you, so let's dive in. We're gonna start from these real drums I made, because real drums are usually softer and it can be more difficult to make them hit hard. But later in the video, we're also gonna go through some house and hip-hop drums, and you'll see the approach is exactly the same. These drums are coming from Addictive Drums. They sound so good, so real, but at the same time, they also sound a little bit weak. Like if you were in the room with a drummer playing these real drums, they would sound so punchy, so aggressive, but now here they sound kind of weak. So what can we do? First thing, we got to think of the drums in 2 different ways. 1, the individual samples, so the kick, the hats, the snare, and 2, the drums as a whole, what we call drum bus. So all the drums playing at the same time. And the key here is that we're gonna process both the individual samples and the drum bus. Starting from the individual samples, the first thing that I like to ask myself is, do any of these sounds need some layering? And if you don't know what layering means, it just means that we keep these samples that we've chosen because we like the sound selection as our main samples, but we add other samples on top of these that can complement the sounds that we already have to add something that's missing. Sometimes it's just some energy missing. Sometimes it can be like the top of the kick. Sometimes it can just be a clap on top of the snare. In this case, the snare sounds already pretty good. The hats, I like them, but the kick is definitely not there. I mean, I like the sound of it, but it doesn't have enough punch. It doesn't have enough top. So the first thing that I'm thinking is finding another kick to use as our top kick. I want something a little bit clickier that we can add on top. And I actually have a pro tip for you about this. When you feel the need to hear your kick better in the mix, sometimes all you need is just adding a little bit of top, not boosting the volume, not enhancing the low end. You're gonna notice how just adding a top layer or just enhancing the top that your kick may already have can help you detecting the kick in the whole mix, because the top of the kick is the thing that our ear can hear better. In this case, I chose this other kick sample that I'm gonna filter a little bit, like 400 hertz or something, so we make sure that we don't have all the low end that's already present in the other kick. So now you can definitely hear that top that was not there before. And I actually want to attenuate this just a little bit. And we also want to make it real short. We don't need any tail coming from this layer. So with the envelopes, by making the decay, the release really short, the sustain to 0, we have this super short sample playing on top of our kick. Yeah. And this brings me to step number 2, which is tuning your samples. Sometimes just playing with the tuning of your kicks, snares, hats can dramatically change the way your samples are punching. And especially when layering, like in this case, you always want to play with it. Like in this case, I settled on +3. This was the original tuning of the sample. I mean, it's okay. It's still adding that top, but I like this better. Like this was more noticeable to me and not bothering. Very cool. Also, tuning the kick to the key of the song or like to the main bass note of your song can be very helpful sometimes, as long as your kick is already pretty close to that note and still sounds good. If you start from a kick tuned to like D and you want to tune it to A, it's probably not going to sound the same anymore. At that point, just choose a different kick sample. So before processing the snare and the hat, there is one very important thing left to do on that kick, which brings me to step number 3, compression. We layered 2 samples, but we want to make it sound like it's a unique thing. And that's where compression is going to help us. My personal preference for kicks is using some sort of SSL compressor emulation. In this case, I'm using this one from Brainworks, but don't worry, because in a second, I'm going to show you how to obtain the same result with the Ableton stock plugin, the glue compressor. So you just dial in the threshold little by little until you're happy with the result. I think I want to keep it somewhere around here. The compression is pretty hard, like around 6 dBs, but that's the way I like it. And what happens when you compress sounds this way is that most of the times you tend to lose a little bit of low end. And so what I'm gonna do, since this is not only a compressor, but this is like a channel strip, I can add back some low end, like around 50, 60 hertz, something like that. And this is really gonna bring back that body of the kick that we may have lost with the compression. And I also wanna enhance that top just a little bit more. Something like that. I'm happy with this. I just wanna make sure that I'm not distorting, so I'm gonna bring this down so we keep some headroom and we try to match the gain before the compression. I think this is pretty close, but you can definitely hear the difference, like how the two layers now sound as a unique thing. We can easily get the same result with stock plugins, so I'm gonna load this glue compressor, deactivate this, and I'm gonna set it pretty much the same way. So the attack around like 30 milliseconds, the release pretty short. You can go for 0.1, 0.2 if you want to. And then the threshold around, I wanna, again, pretty strong compression, like around 5 dBs or something. Let's make up for the volume. This sounds pretty much the same because the glue compressor is actually a replica of the SSL compressor. So this is very close. I'm also gonna add some frequencies because remember that here in this section, we also enhance the low end. I'm gonna do the same thing with this EQ8. So around like 50, 60 hertz. I'm gonna boost the low end a little bit. We can do 1.5 around 10,000. This is pretty good. So we have the Brainworks versus glue compressor and EQ8. Wow. One very cool trick that you can use if enhancing the low end with the EQ is not enough is using this plugin, the BX Subfilter. This is a free plugin, so you can download it right away after you finish watching this video. What this does is adding harmonics in the low end. And with these types of kicks, acoustic kicks that don't have a very present low end, this can really feel like a cheat code because listen to the difference before and after. Wow. You always want to check your output because when you add that many low frequencies, for sure it's going to distort. So bring it down a little bit. So this was a free plugin plus the Ableton stock plugins. So basically $0. And these plugins sound just amazing. We're going to see compression again later when we process the drum bus. But now we're going to move on to step number 4, which is something that we're going to apply to pretty much every single sample of our drums. And this is transient shaping. So let's take the kick, for example. We added that top layer. If I play it in solo, I can definitely hear it. But in the mix, it's kind of lost. And that's exactly where the transient shaper comes handy. And my favorite one to use lately is by far this one by Kilohertz, another completely free plugin that works just amazing. It also has this pump feature, really cool, that is not really a thing in the other transient shapers that I use. But in this case, it's mainly the attack. Oh yeah. And also reducing a little bit of sustain just to have a little bit of a shorter tail. And enabling this clip is always a good idea with transient shapers because they tend to bring the signal way over 0 dB. So this way it gets clipped and it sounds real good. Before. After. Oh. Okay, now I can definitely hear it in the mix. I love this. And one little trick that I use all the time is if the transient shaper makes your sound better, like in this case, but the top becomes a little bit too bothering to your ears, I like to apply a very gentle filtering with this plugin, which is again a free plugin, and I'm gonna leave all the links in the description for all of these plugins that we're using. And maybe now you're thinking,
okay, but what's the point of enhancing the transients if now you're filtering?
Well, the two things don't cancel each other. So it's still better to filter a signal that's been enhanced a little bit with a transient shaper than not doing anything. If I just remove both of these plugins, this is what it was sounding like. Now it's way more punchy, but that top is not bothering. It's like not super clicky, but you know, there's a big difference. And I want to do some transient shaping also on the hats, making them a little bit shorter, a little bit tighter. So I'm enhancing the attack, decreasing the sustain. This is another very good transient shaper. This is by Native Instruments, but again, you can obtain pretty much the same results, if not better, with this Kilohertz. So the hats before, now a little bit tighter. Love it. Same thing on the snare, just very subtle, but I want it to pop a little bit more. Decreasing the sustain just a little bit so we don't have a long tail. especially on these ghost notes. And this, guys, is something that I suggest you do on the individual samples, but not on the drum bus. That's why we're doing this now. You want to get to the drum bus with this already taken care of. So make sure to do this at this stage. The next step can sound kind of obvious, but it's really important to get rid of any unwanted frequencies before going to the drum bus or enhancing some missing frequencies. And we do that with EQing. Pretty straightforward. What I'm hearing at the moment is a little bit of boxiness in this snare. I definitely want to get rid of it before we get to the drum bus, because processing the drum bus is only going to enhance it. So this is the area that I'm talking about, a little bit of boxiness here. I'm using the FabFilter Pro Q3, which is my favorite EQ, but you can do the exact same thing with Ableton stock EQ, the EQ8. You just find the frequency that you want, you reduce it a little bit. And here I also found this one, this kind of whistle that was bothering me. And on the kick, we already added some frequencies earlier, both with the EQ and this subfilter plugin. So as you can see, all of these techniques are related to each other. Like with the kick, we had some compression, and then to compensate for that low end that gets lost, that's where you EQ. These hats, I just want to make them a little bit brighter, a little bit more present. So this is the first thing I did. I removed something here, added some other frequencies here on top for some more presence. And sometimes, if this is not enough, bonus tip for you guys, I like to use OTT. And whether you use this one or just the stock OTT from Ableton, it's exactly the same thing. It has the same controls. The OTT is a multiband compressor, but as you can see, it also has some EQing features, both on this one and on this one. So it can definitely help making your sounds stand out a little bit more, like before and after. Wow. It's really bringing out some life. Maybe it's just a little bit louder than before, but you know, why not? But I like to think of the OTT like my last possible resource. I don't like to overuse it. I try to add it just at the end if I need to add something extra. And we finally get to my favorite technique of this whole list. Step number 6, saturation. We could talk about saturation for hours, but just think that saturation can be very helpful to add some harmonics to your sounds. And that's the reason why we like to saturate 808s or bass in general, because when coming out of the phones, you're gonna hear the bass thanks to all of those harmonics introduced by saturation. You still won't be able to hear those super low frequencies from a phone, but you will be able to detect what the bass is doing thanks to all of those harmonics that the saturation has added. And depending on how much saturation you add, you're gonna notice how your sounds get grittier, more aggressive. I'm gonna start from saturating the snare. I love this plugin, wow. Listen to this. So before and after. Very good. This is super simple to use, a saturation that's very musical, and a great alternative is this plugin, this stock Ableton plugin, Roar, which I just found out about just like a month ago. I started using this, and this has like so much power. It's an incredible saturation plugin, also coloring plugin. You have so many ways of saturating your sounds. You also have a compressor in it. It's like amazing. This is really, really amazing. I started from this preset, and listen how close this is to this other paid plugin. It may even sound better. I don't know. Like, I'm undecided. Like between this and this. This is probably a little bit more aggressive still, but I can go harder with the dry wet, with the saturation amount, you know. And also this tone knob is very, very cool. It's gonna give a totally different character to the saturation that you apply. Listen. Right? Without it. With it. Wow. Amazing. I love this plugin. Okay, now let's go back to the kick. Remember that we tamed it down a little bit after applying the transient shaper. Okay, so I think a little bit of grit, a little bit of those harmonics that saturation is gonna bring in, it's just gonna help the kick standing out a little bit more. I wanna use Roar once again, something like that. I wanna keep the dry wet pretty low, around like 18, 20. I don't want any compression here. And the tone, I brought it down a little bit because this is mainly low frequencies. I want to keep it pretty dark sounding, but without it, with it. Just subtle difference, but in the mix, all of these things really add up and they make a difference. So we processed all the individual drums. They sound individually amazing. So we're now ready to go into the drum bus. And we're just missing one step that we haven't discussed yet. But before we get to that, what I'm about to say is probably the most important thing of the whole video. So pay attention. I can't stress enough the importance of going into the drum bus with the correct amount of headroom. So this orange group is our drum bus, and all of these individual samples are going into that group. So if your individual samples like the kick, the snare, the hats are all individually too loud and already pretty close to hitting 0 dB, the sum of them, so the signal that's being sent into the drum bus, is obviously going to be louder. So it's obviously going to go way above 0 dB. And if that's the case, you're not going to have any room to work on the drum bus. And as soon as you apply any processing, you're going to start distorting and ruin the sound of your drums completely. So you always want to check this. And if you realize that your drums are hitting too hard before going into the drum bus, no problem. You just take them all and you bring them all down by the same amount. So you keep them relatively at the same volume, but all a little bit quieter. Okay, so for the drum bus, some of the steps that we've seen for the individual samples, we're going to reapply them. But stay with me because the way we do it, it's going to be a little bit different. And also there's still... Shit.
Ah, sì, sì, io ce l'ho. La nonna mi ha chiamato stamattina, lei, eh? Sì, sì. Sì, sì, lei mi ha chiamato.
But stay with me because we're going to do things a little bit differently now. And also there's one missing step, a crucial step that we haven't covered yet. And it's going to be at the end of the chain of our drum bus. So we're going to start by compressing these drums together. And by now, you should know it. My favorite compressor for doing this is the API 2500 from UAD. This is a great replica. And I love the sound of this compressor. The goal here is only making sure that these drums sound a little bit more glued together. Sometimes you might have a snare that's peaking a little bit too loud. Most of the times the compression is going to help bringing out the hats a little bit more. And the way I like to set it is long attack so the transients can get through. Very short release. Of course, you have, different modes that you can choose. I like this combination, for example, with this compressor. And most of the times, a gain reduction of around 3 dBs is going to be more than enough. In this case, you can definitely hear the difference. Listen. Like it's so well glued together. I love the sound of this compressor. Maybe it's a little bit too much, so I might dial this back a little bit. We're definitely losing a little bit of low end like it happened before when we applied compression only to the kick, but don't worry because if you need to, you can always make up for it later. Once again, the glue compressor is a great alternative for this. It doesn't sound exactly the same, just the sound of the two compressor is a little bit different, but this is still great. Like this is always a very good option to use on a drum bus. I said it basically the same way, but yeah, the sound, it's kind of similar, but not exactly the same. And next we have saturation. My two favorites for the drum bus are the Studer and this loop trotter. Today I feel like using the loop trotter, so we're gonna try this. This is gonna make such a massive difference. I wanna go for one of these presets. I'm gonna try this one. Wow. Amazing. Sounds insane. Just might have to tweak some of these parameters slightly, but I already love the sound of this. But if you don't have this, don't worry, stock plugins are gonna work just fine. Again, I'm using this roar to get a very similar result. Listen to this. So as you can see, I'm building a rack which emulates what I'm doing with these paid plugins, and I'm only doing this with stock plugins. Oh my God, listen to this. Too much, of course, but like, this is really competing for like my top saturation plugins at the moment. And just listen to the difference, like this one, paid plugins, and this one. Like, these sound insanely good. We're almost ready for that one missing thing. But before that, we only need to add some final EQ, some final touches, some final frequencies that we might want to remove or we might want to add. And my favorite plugin for doing these kind of things is the Mag EQ. This is very, very good for subtle changes. It has this super cool feature, the air knob. This is what made this plugin famous. Actually, not only the plugin, the hardware EQ as well. You can just select like 20K as the frequency, and then you can add as much air as you need. This is, of course, like way too much, but I just want some more clarity on top. And I also went for some reduction around 650 and also enhanced slightly 2.5K. So without it and with it. just a little bit of clarity on top. And if you need to add that low end that you might have lost with compression, you can do it now. I don't feel the need to do it, to be honest. I'm happy with the low end that we have, even if we have lost a little bit with compression, but I mean, it doesn't feel like it needs it. And I kind of replicated the same behavior of the mag with this EQ here for our stock Ableton rack. And finally, we get to step number 7, soft clipping. When I started producing, I had no idea what this was. I always thought that clipping was bad, you know, like never go close to 0 dB. And I was like, okay, but here we're talking about soft clipping. And to better explain what this is, a soft clipper plugin is a specific type of clipper that rounds off the peaks of an audio signal rather than abruptly truncating them. This results in analog style clipping that sounds much smoother than hard digital clipping. What all of this means is if I have, for example, this kick, which is pretty close to hitting 0 dBs, you can see it from the waveform, and I apply some saturation driving, for example, 6 dBs, you would expect this sound to go way above the threshold and something like this to happen with all of the peaks that go above 0 dB to just get cut completely. What we get with soft clip engaged instead is a waveform that looks something like this with all of these nice rounded edges. So basically all of that information is not lost. And now the kick sounds like this. It has that nice, gritty saturation feeling, that analog warmth added to the sound. The waveform is not harshly cut like it would be with digital clipping, which would also result in a not as pleasant sound. And my favorite plugin for doing this is by far Standard Clip. I like to use it this way with a little bit of gain in input, a little bit of clipping, some saturation here. You can definitely see the kick is what gets clipped the most, and also a little bit on the snare. But listen to the sound of this. It sounds so musical. Like, the saturation is pleasant, is very warm, and also it's making the drums sound way louder before, after. Wow. But again, there are so many clippers around. If you don't have that one, don't worry. We're gonna try to replicate this with stock Ableton plugins. And for this, I like to use most of the times just the saturator, you know, because it has this soft clip feature right here. But one alternative could also be using the glue compressor again, not for compressing though. So if you want to use it as a soft clipper instead of a compressor, you just put the range back to 0 dB so it doesn't compress at all. You activate the soft clip and basically you use the makeup as your drive. So you can see this is blinking, meaning that it's actually clipping something. It's clipping both the kick and also the snare. It sounds very good as well. But I like to use this one most of the times just because you have more options, you know? You can go for analog clip, soft sine. I'm trying to replicate these settings, like the soft clip of Standard Clip. I kind of find this medium curve to be quite close. So you can also, you know, you can also go crazy, but of course you gotta be a little bit careful with this. Maybe 3 dBs or something like we did with Standard Clip is gonna be more than enough. And of course, you can always apply soft clipping to the individual samples as well. In this case, I didn't feel the need to do it when we were working on the kick, on the snare, on the hats. I was happy with the sound that we had. But for example, with these hip hop drums that I made, I also went for soft clipping on the kick. I needed a kick that was a little bit more aggressive, punchy, gritty. So I went for soft clipping also here directly on the kick and also on the drum bus. So we get something like this. Compared to, like, where are the drums? This is where I started from. Sound selection is good, but these drums are not punchy. Oh yeah, now we're talking. And same exact thing, same exact approach for these house drums. As you can see, processing on the individual samples, layering. I applied some compression here, some filtering, EQing. On the class, we have some saturation. On the hats, we have some transient shaping. So all of these techniques that we've seen for the real drums and the hip hop drums also apply to house drums and actually any genre. Same thing for the drum bus. What you're hearing now, the difference that you're hearing now is only coming from these stock plugins. So without it, and with it. Wow, so much more energy. Like, Unbelievable. Alright guys, we got to the end. I really hope that this video was helpful and that you got something out of it. You're gonna have to get familiar with all of these concepts, but if you start implementing one by one, you're gonna be able to bring your drums to the next level in no time. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, leave a comment below, let me know how it goes, or if you have any questions, recommendations for future videos. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.